Hello crafty friends, it's Jess from jesscrafts.com, and today I have something a little bit different. I'm going to be working with 6x6 paper again, but this time I want to show you how you can use up an entire piece of 6x6 paper to make 2 cards without leaving any scraps at all. So I'm going to use a Sunny Studio paper pad sleek stripes today, and the thought there is this is a paper pad that I wouldn't do a 6x6 tutorial with. It's just a lot of simple patterns, so there's either straight stripes or diagonal stripes depending on which side of the paper you use. I'll give a quick flip through here, but I wanted to share this because I think you can do this with pretty much any 6x6 paper in your collection. I think it works well with something that's double-sided because you are going to use pieces of the same piece of paper to create your card. You could mix it up because the way that I'm suggesting that you cut it would allow you to get the same size pieces from multiple pieces of 6x6 paper. You could mix up your papers. There will be a coordinating blog post where I share exactly how you should cut everything and all the measurements that you'll need, and a card sketch with the measurements so that you could use this to recreate or use up your 6x6 paper pads. So I took my 6x6 piece of paper, I cut 1 inch off, then I cut that piece of paper in half. So I currently have 2 pieces of 1 inch by 3 inch pattern paper. Now I'm going to be cutting this pattern paper that is left, that's 6x5, at 1 inch marks so that I'm left with 6 pieces of 1 by 5 inch paper. And all of those pieces together are going to create 2 cards that are exactly the same. And there's, of course, going to be no scraps left because I'm using everything. Now, I am choosing to add some cardstock mats, which means like a little piece of cardstock around the pattern paper. You could probably do without, but I think it really adds a lot. And I will say, while cutting the mats, and I will tell you, the sketch will also have the mat sizes, which are just a 1/4 inch bigger. So the pattern paper is 1 by 5. Therefore, the mat that goes around it is 1 1/4 by 5 1/4. The other piece of paper is 1 by 3, so it's 1 1/4 by 3 1/4. When you cut those sizes out of an 8.5 by 11 piece of cardstock, you actually won't be left with very many scraps. You could, cut a bunch that size, but if you're only cutting just enough for these cards, you will have some scraps left. However, I am going to be die cutting my sentiment, so you could use those scraps for that, or anything else in your craft room. I figure most people are looking how to use up their pattern paper and aren't so much concerned about cardstock scraps. I think you have a lot more uses for cardstock scraps, and specifically I'll share later on what I mean about in terms of using them for the die cutting out a sentiment. So here I'm going to add adhesive to the back of all of my cardstock pieces. I already glued all of my pattern paper pieces to it, and I'll show you how I'm going to assemble this card, and then I'm going to move on to another way to cut up your paper, and I'll finish both cards. So I suggest that you put the 2 side strips down first, and then you can center the middle one. I'm not worried about like everything being exact on the sides. I kind of just eyeball it. Again, if you go to my blog, there will be a link in the video description, and I'll show you exactly the card sketch, the measurements, how to cut things. Because my paper is double-sided, I will take advantage of that. For my next set of cards that you can create, you get 2 cards out of 1 6x6 piece of paper, and they're exactly the same. I cut my paper down the middle so that I create 2 3x6 pieces. Then I take a 3x6 piece and I cut it at 3.5. So I'm left with a piece that's 3.5 by 3 inches, everything of course in inches because the pattern paper is 6 inches. And then the other piece is 2.5 by 3. Then I will cut cardstock mats that are again a 1/4 inch bigger. I messed up when I cut them the first time. Again, I'm not too concerned about creating black scraps of this cardstock because I have many uses for them, including, as I'll show you later, sometimes I just tape 2 pieces of cardstock scrap together and I use that to make my own like foam tape. Of course, it's not foam because it's made with cardstock, but it will help me pop up an element. without having to purchase any additional materials, and it helps me to use my scraps. So again, I matted them on black cardstock 1/4 inch bigger, and then I laid them out according to the sketch. Now, I wanted to use this Sparkle Word also from Sunny Studios. I'm going to use a few products from Sunny Studios as well as a stamp set from the Greeting Farm. If all you were interested in was how to use the 6x6 paper, I'm just assembling the cards now, so I suggest heading over to the blog post and saving that information. But here I cut the Sparkle Word 2 times out of my scraps of black cardstock, and then I cut it out of a glitter cardstock. I think these cards where you're using up pieces of 6x6 paper, picking neutrals like that go really well with it, like in this case black and white, those are readily available, and you can purchase a lot of black and white cardstock rather cheaply. So if you're trying to use up a lot of 6x6 paper, it's great to have a big pack to go with. I'm going to use this Born to Sparkle stamp set from Sunny Studios as well to finish off my sentiments. One of the reasons that using this more simplistic pattern worked out is that I can do some stamping directly onto the paper here. If you're using a busier pattern paper, you might want to just use a word sentiment as opposed to stamping part of it. I could, of course, like I have sentiments that like die cut sentiments that just say things like hugs or hello, and you could totally use that, and that would work over pretty much any pattern paper. But because I had this more simplistic pattern paper, I thought I would extend out my sentiment. It was just something that I felt like working with, but I think you could easily adapt this. I'm going to stamp the You Were Born To. You could, of course, stamp this with a stamping tool to make sure you get a great impression. But to make sure that my impression was good without a stamping tool, I did just stamp it a few times on a piece of scrap, which was basically just a Post-it note. And you can see that I stamped sentiments on it several times because I just want to make sure nothing's like, I don't know if you ever get like a little fuzz on your sentiment. And then if you stamp it down, it will create a little bit of a mishap. And so I just would always rather test my sentiment first if I'm going directly to my card, since everything's adhered already. I did use my Barely Art glue. If you have watched my channel before, you know that that's my favorite liquid glue. And I use that to glue all of those sparkle words together. It can be quite challenging to glue something to glitter paper, but because the glitter is the top layer, that doesn't particularly matter. However, if you were to try to glue something to glitter paper, Barely Art glue is a really strong glue that I've had success with in terms of that. Also, if a little bit of the glue seeps out on the sides, my experience, it dries clear, and so there's no problem with that. I'm going to be adding these little fairies from the Greeting Farm to my cards. I'm going to do some Copic coloring here, and I'm going to quickly walk you through it because I have this one little technique that you might find helpful. I'm going to color my fairies as little black characters, and therefore their skin is going to be this darker tone, E29, 27, and 25, but I'm also going to color little afro puffs on them. And so it's going to take just a little bit of modification to these buns. I like stamp sets that have hairstyles that are more adaptable, and in general, I like seeing that some stamp companies are now coming out with more diverse stamps. To get the little afro puffs, what I'm going to do is start with a base of W5 all over the hair and the little buns, and then I'm going to take my W10 marker and I'm going to make little bumps outside so that it looks like the hair is more curly. There are these little wisps of hair that are coming out of the buns that kind of make the fairies look a little bit more whimsical. I'm going to incorporate that in, and now that I've created this sort of curly look, I can go in with a few more curls in the different colors. So I started with the W10. I'm going to take my W7 very, very briefly, add a couple more little curl or C shapes into the afro puffs, and then I'm going to do the same thing with the W5. For their hair, I'm just creating really simple strokes along the artist-drawn hair lines, and that's basically going to be it for the coloring of the hair. Very simple, but a nice modification to that stamp to make it a little bit more diverse. I am going to be able to cut these out with my scan and cut machine. If I were to cut them out with the dies, the coordinating dies, the hair because it's now a different shape, might not cut out as nicely. So that's one of the reasons that I like a scan and cut, because I can be a little bit more diverse with my stamps in terms of like, even outside of coloring people stamps or changing up hair, things like that, you can, put your stamps together and mask them off, and still you would be able to die cut them perfectly with a scan and cut. So there you can see that my scan and cut was able to go around the hair that I created. And even though they're all not exactly the same, that's not going to matter to the scan and cut. I'm going to take a scrap from the scan and cut and glue it to the other scrap from the scan and cut. And that's because I'm creating that foam tape that I talked about earlier, where it's really just two pieces of cardstock glued together, and it's going to create a really thick piece of cardstock that will add a bit of dimension behind my fairies as I attach them to the card, but I won't have to use foam tape. Now, in this case, one of the reasons I sometimes do this is because it makes your card a little bit more recyclable, because then you're only using cardstock. And in this case, you can't recycle this card because it has glitter on it without like taking it apart. So that's not so much a concern here. It's more just that I don't keep a lot of foam tape in my craft room because I can just do this instead. And I know I suggest this in a lot of videos, so if you've watched my channel, you probably heard this tip before, but I just always like to share it because it's such an easy way to save money. All right, so back to the card, finishing it up, I'm going to glue on my little fairies here. As you saw, all the marker colors were off to the side, so if you were curious what other colors I chose, they were there, and I will try to remember to put them in the video description as well. I'm going to add two little fairies. In retrospect, I wish I would have chosen some fairies that were facing the other way, because if they are all looking away from you, they're not really interacting with each other, and it's drawing your attention off the card as opposed to down towards the sentiment. So if you wanted to add a bit more to your card, I would suggest thinking about critters or character stamps that are facing towards each other to interact a bit more. Because it says you were born to sparkle, and I've already used some glitter paper on this card, I thought why not also add some gems. So these are adhesive gems, and I'm just going to make a little grouping of them. In the case of the pink card, I'm just going to add one fairy. I've again put some of that double cardstock behind her so that she pops up a little bit, because that sparkle word also has dimension. I put 2 layers underneath the glitter paper, which means that it has a lot of dimension. It really stands out. So I want her to stand out as well, and therefore I've popped her up. So that is it for the 2 cards. I will, of course, be able to create 2 exactly the same of the pink and 2 exactly the same of the purple because of the way that I was able to cut the 6x6 paper. And as I mentioned, all the resources that you might need to do this with the pattern paper in your collection are going to be in the coordinating blog post, and I will also link all the other products that I used in case you're interested in any of them. Thank you so much for joining me today. I would love for you to leave me a comment, and I hope that you have an awesome day. Bye.